Good morning, and thank you for joining us for this first in a three-part webinar series focusing on the rural narrative in Muscatine and Louisa counties. My name is Jody Royal Goodwin, and I serve as the Housing and Community Development Director for the City of Muscatine, which also administers the Muscatine County Housing Authority. I also serve as a board member for the Community Foundation of Greater Muscatine. As a native of Louisa and Muscatine counties, this topic and conversation is of great interest and value to me. While I've moved around a bit in my adult life, my moves around the country were always broken up by returns to this area. And 5 years ago, my family moved back to be closer with family after 10 years living in Nevada. My time away from this area has made it apparent that there is a unique and recognizable Midwest attitude, but coming back quickly reminded me of how helpful and collaborative the people that live here are. I appreciate the range of services and activities available within our area and but are much more common in larger communities. I'm impressed by the vitality and momentum of work occurring within our small towns. In our daily routines, we sometimes forget to focus on what the community has going for it, which is why the Community Foundation of Greater Muscatine and the Community Foundation of Louisa County have partnered to bring Ben Winchester to town, so to speak. And I'm confident Ben will change how you think. A little bit on logistics. Your camera and mic will be off during this presentation. If you have any questions, please use the chat feature. We will spend a few minutes answering some questions throughout the session. For the best view of the presenter, panelist, and slides, we recommend clicking on Speaker View in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. We will share Ben's presentation with all participants next week, so please sit back and enjoy. In the chat, if you are comfortable, we would ask that you tell us your name, where you work, what county you live in, and were you originally from either Muscatine or Louisa County. As I said earlier, we are lucky to have Ben with us today. Ben Winchester is a national keynote speaker who has been working both in and for small towns across the Midwest for over 25 years. He lives in St. Cloud, Minnesota with his wife and 2 children. Ben is trained as a rural sociologist and works as a senior research fellow for the University of Minnesota Extension. His applied research on economic, social, and demographic topics surrounding a theme of rewriting the rural narrative provides a new way of looking at and thinking about rural America. Winchester received his BA in Mathematics and Statistics from the University of Minnesota Morris in 1995 and an MS in Rural Sociology from the University of Missouri-Columbia in 2001. Ben was a founding member at the Center for Small Towns, an outreach and engagement program of the University of Minnesota, and specializes in community development, demographic analysis, and data visualization. Welcome, Ben.
Great, thank you, Jody. Hi, everybody. Good morning on this beautiful day. I'm, a couple hours north of you all, and we had, planned to be there in person with you all earlier this year, but really thanks to the community foundations here for the work that they've done and really trying to, bring your communities forward and trying to address some of the real challenges and the opportunities that you've got, not just today, but you'll have in the future. So as Jody mentioned, we've got a 3-part series here. Today is the first one. We've got another one in 2 weeks and another one 2 weeks after that. And I'll give you some sneak peeks about that as we move forward here. But let me first kind of get my screen share going. So my own background, I'm a rural sociologist with the University of Minnesota Extension. I think many of you know Extension as the 4-H people, right? Like I wasn't even in 4-H as a kid, but how do you not know about 4-H in our rural communities? So for me, it's been a real pleasure to do work in Extension. I think Extension is one of the most visible, viable organizations that's worked not just in your community, but across the nation in helping our small towns and our rural places better themselves. So it was early in my career that I started to do this work around what I call rewriting the rural narrative. And the premise really behind all of my research in my life is that the narrative we're using to describe our small towns and our rural places is, to put it bluntly, terrible. You would think all of our small towns were dying, that there's nobody left, and the lucky few escape. Even this kind of quote here, this living in the middle of everywhere. I mean, this is part and parcel of this narrative that we've got about our rural communities and our small towns. But you'll see the subtitle here is Speak Softly and Carry Statistics. I'm a data geek. I love data. Data tells me a lot of things, data and research. So I know many of you don't like data. So hopefully everything you see here today will be consumable and understandable as we move forward. And I try to make my case that rural communities are not dying, that we actually have a lot of really great things going on if we kind of look under the radar. So to kind of start to peel back the onion here a little bit, I just want to kind of remind you all that right now, there is more interest in rural living than ever before. And so you see some of the headlines more recently during the pandemic. We've got a lot of folks thinking about moving to rural communities. And a lot of folks kind of think this is new. And I just want to say that, to all these people who are like, hey, there's this renewed interest in rural. I just want to say, welcome to the party. We've been doing this work on rural community migration for decades, and there have been people with an interest in living in our rural communities. But we're really just kind of waiting to see how this is going to play out in our small towns. And we'll talk about some of these pieces. But there was a world just 8 months ago. It's a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. I kind of like the Star Wars quote here because it's kind of hard to imagine the world that we were in just 8-9 months ago here. But we were in a tight labor market. We had a workforce housing shortage. We still have those things. But now we have even more pressure because we've got additional people interested in moving to and living in our small towns and our rural places. So in many ways, I want to take you back. I want to take you back to the world we were in just 8 months before and take you to a world that we will return to, hopefully in the near future, with regards to some sense of normality. I do have a colleague, Randy Cantrell at the University of Nebraska, who is a fellow rural sociologist. And in terms of when are things going to get back to normal, he's done a lot of studies about kind of structural things that happen to society. And he says, generally, it takes about 3 years and people are right back into the swing of their old lives. So I just want to go back and kind of paint this picture and where we were. So I do want to step back a little bit further and talk about my own background. So I went to school. I grew up in Winona, Minnesota, which is southeastern Minnesota. I traveled around I've got family in Decorah and northeastern Iowa, spent a lot of time stomping around there. And I went to school in Morris. Now, Morris is a town of about 5,000 people. And at the time I thought, wow, this is a super small town. I grew up in a town of 30,000 people. I get to Morris, which is 5,000. And it's easy for me to think that this is a small town, but I quickly realized that 5,000 people is actually a pretty good sized city, right? Most of the small towns, 85% of our small towns have less than 2,500 people in them. So, every time you hear of a town like Morris, there's like a dozen other towns that we really never even heard about. So just with regards to my own history, I started to really love Morris. I started to love small towns and rural life. And I was like, I want to work here. I want to live here. And so at the time, Roger McCannon, who was the head of continuing education in Morris at the Morris campus, had said, you know what, Ben, we're going to start this organization called the Center for Small Towns. I want you to be the first employee. And I was like, right on, because I wanted to stay, right? It's kind of hard to make it work when I was a young person to really understand what my options truly were. So he gave me a chance here to work in and for small towns. And I certainly said yes. And so really as an academic, though, I wanted to read books. I wanted to read literature. Like, how are people talking about small towns and rural places? And these are the typical things you see. And you still see these today, that people keep leaving rural America. Small towns are playing a role in their own demise. There's another headline out of a major national newspaper 2 years ago called From Breadbasket to Basket Case. Like, you couldn't have written a more disrespectful headline about our rural communities if you tried. Right? I mean, if you're a mental health professional, you should be up in arms about using this kind of terminology to, talk about an entire swath of the country. We also have rural Minnesota's in trouble, and that's a Minnesota specific one. There's a county too that's got the lowest per capita income in the country. And, they get sick of being, we're the poster child for the war on poverty. So in many times this narrative is very pervasive. In fact, we have books too, not just kind of these articles in newspapers talking about us in rural America, but we've got books, right? Fighting for the American Countryside, The Decline of Rural Minnesota, Survival of Rural America, Hollowing Out the Middle. Like, if you kind of look through all of these pieces, you would think, man, our small towns are dying, right? This is the most common narrative you hear, that people prefer living in the city. Our best and brightest leave our small towns, that the only people who are left are the people who could not get out, right? Well, This is not the case. I'm going to provide you with a ton of evidence as to why this narrative, while it may exist in some places, certainly should not be the only narrative we use to describe our small towns and rural places. So really, when we look at this narrative that we use, it's very pervasive. Again, there's a talk about this brain drain, and that's where this book on the previous slide, Hollowing Out the Middle, takes its part. And what this book really focuses on is our young people, our 18 to 21-year-olds, right? Pretty much after high school graduation, you've got a lot of people that leave. Roughly 40 to 60% of your young people are going to leave after graduation. And you are not an anomaly if your kids leave. You are the rule. Right? But we play it off that, it's happening to us, but it's not happening to them. Well, I'll tell you that this brain drain, i.e. when our young people leave after high school graduation, happens everywhere. It happens in metro places too. There are actually very few places that end up being net recipients of those folks, and they tend to be core metro, military, college, and tech school towns, community college towns. That is primarily where our 18-year-olds go. But meanwhile, we have this terminology around the brain drain. Now our whole town is going to call themselves a brain drain town, when all we're talking about are the 18-year-olds that are leaving. So we'll talk in more in depth about this. We live in the middle of nowhere. Like, what are you really telling people when you say that? I think we use it kind of, tongue in cheek, but really it's fairly indicative of how we talk about our places and then how people perceive many of our rural places themselves. We're a sleepy town, or everybody knows one another. Like, those aren't true. These aren't true. Like, you're not a sleepy town. Like, everybody knows one another. That's not true. You know roughly 20 to 30% of all the people in town. And of those, you don't even know all those people well. You may know of them and generally who they are as people, but I think we take a lot of liberties to kind of project what we do and don't know about other people in town. Nobody locks their doors, right? And again, especially media articles, they've got these all the time. And the Kellogg Foundation will actually tell you that if you see a lot of things like this, like everybody knows one another in this small town, or nobody locks their doors, like that's not the sign of a reporter that's done their job. That's a sign of a lazy reporter that's working upon their stereotypes to describe what they see in this small town. And in many places across this country, we have a narrative based upon what we had, what we don't have, like our neighbors have this, but we don't, what we wish we had or what we could have had. I end up seeing a lot of community conversations take place around some type of historical event that happened in the past that people tend to look to say, well, this was true in Morris, where I went to school. There was a story in town, very common, that 3M was going to be moving to town in the 60s, but the county, they didn't rezone the land. So 3M never came. Well, when you look back on the minutes and whatnot, like 3M never actually considered the town. They were never on the radar. There was never a zoning issue. So why do we have this narrative? And it's not just Morris that had this narrative. I hear this narrative all the time. We could have had X if we would have just done blank, right? In many ways, I believe we have these rationalizations when we look back and want to find something to blame because we don't believe we are where we should be. And when we don't believe where we are where we should be, then we're going to try to find some reason why we're not where we want to be or should be. And so many times we look back and start to point fingers. But I'll tell you that there are a lot of reasons why we've gone through changes in our small towns, and we can't use speculation to kind of derail a conversation about what really is happening in our small town. So I'm going to introduce a term to you called anecdata. Anecdata is information which is presented as if it's based on serious research, but in fact, it's based on what somebody thinks is true. Like, you hear this all the time. You have somebody who's like, oh, everybody's moving to the coast. Well, when I look at the data, you had 3 people in the past 20 years that moved to the coast. Like, this kind of narrative becomes pervasive. But really, when you look at this term, what's in that term is anecdote. An anecdote is when somebody says something. Well, the plural, as a data guy, I'll let you know that the plural of anecdote is not trend. You get 3 people sitting around a table talking about how terrible your town is. Like, that's not a trend. That's 3 people that, for whatever reason, certainly believe that. Well, let's not kind of project what they believe to everybody else in the community as well. So we have gone through some dramatic changes in our small towns, early 1900s. I mean, I don't want to take away from the fact we have changed. And most of these changes took place 80 years ago, 100 years ago, the mechanization of agriculture alone reduced the number of farm workers by 40 to 80% in many of our places. So no longer could your 5 kids really get a job on the farm. So now they did go to the metro, and we started to see our rural populations decline during this time period in the early 1900s. I'm talking about 1910, 1920. At this very exact same time that we mechanized agriculture, roads and transportation systems started to, be built across this country. So, we really went from a time frame where we had no roads to roads. So we went from horse and buggy to vehicles over 10 years. And this was transformative, not just for the towns themselves, but how we saw each other. Because now I didn't live in this isolated place. I'm able to get to the doctor 2 towns over in the morning, as opposed to taking an entire day trip to get there. Like I basically say, we went from horse and buggy to not horse and buggy in 10 years. So if you're talking about like Little House on the Prairie, like they would take their trip from Walnut Grove to Mankato for their appointments or for major shopping, and it would take them a day to get there. Well, now if you're in Walnut Grove, you can get to Mankato and back in a day because of transportation. So these types of activities are transformative in how our towns saw themselves and how we saw each other and how we looked at each other as a complementary community that we all share. So we also, during this time, had educational achievement. The GI Bill afforded an opportunity for rural veterans, which are overrepresented in the military, for the first time in many of their families to ever get a college degree. And they would come back home and they bring their degrees with them. We also started to see churches closed. And during this time frame, it wasn't that people weren't going to church. It was that you weren't just all Lutherans in town. Like you had some Catholics move in, and now we've got a new church built, right? So we really diversified our communities in that respect. Then in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and in the 80s, we'll talk about some of these trends were also transformative. Main Street restructuring. This is a really kind way of saying that, businesses closed. And, here's Sleepy Eye, Minnesota. When you look at a picture of a small town, I think we have this idyllic kind of Norman Rockwellish view of what we think we should see in a small town. And that is like a filled Main Street with businesses here and there and like people walking up and down the street. But our small towns today don't look like that. And why is that? It's because we have restructured economically many of those businesses, not because of our choice, but because we live in the modern world. So we closed hardware stores, we closed grocery stores, apothecaries. No longer are you going to have 2 to 4 gas stations in every town. Now you're down to 1. So it's easy though, when you drive through town, to look at the left and look at the right and to see like, well, there's the boarded up bank building, there's the boarded up school, there's the boarded up, grocery store. And it's easy to think that your small town is dying. In fact, many of these proclamations are made rather quickly right after these things close. And you look at the local media and other media of how they portray these restructurings. It's, if we close our grocery store, our small town's going to die. If we close our hardware store, our small town's going to die. Well, show me all the dead towns. Like they're not around here, and they're not around for good reason. And I want to remind you that every time you see a hardware store or grocery store close in your small town, there's one that closed in Des Moines too. There's one that closed in Chicago, in Minneapolis, in Los Angeles. But when you close a hardware store or grocery store in a major metropolitan area, you've got 3 to 5 other options, sometimes within walking distance. But if you close a hardware store or grocery store in a small town, it's probably your only one. Now, I bring this up because it is not our fault, because we should have spent more money. I should have shopped locally more, right? Those aren't going to save you. Like these impacts on our small town retail and commercial shops are the impact of globalization. Globalization impacts everybody. You are not unique because your grocery store was closed. You are part and parcel of the trends that are impacting everybody in this world. And if you still do have a grocery store, you're fighting the trend, right? And we're finding ways to make it work despite these heavy influences upon structural changes in our communities. School consolidations too took place. I'm sure many of you remember these in the 80s and 90s. It was very prevalent where, basically you would consolidate schools where one community would have the elementary school and another neighboring community would have the high school. And then you do a lot of busing, or sometimes you closed all the schools and you put a school in the middle of the countryside. And again, the narrative at the time is our small towns are dying. But I want to remind you, the number one reason why your school consolidated is not because of an open enrollment, not because of private schools, which tend to be used as the rationale for why it happened in the first place. The number one reason why your school consolidated is your birth rate. Your birth rate went down. when literally you went from your incoming class used to be 20 kids, and 15 years later, it was 10, right? So now your outgoing class is always larger than your incoming class. Your total numbers are going down. But the birth rate, I mean, this is part and parcel of living in the modern world, is our birth rates go down. We have fewer kids. So this, as opposed to globalization, this you might actually have some control over. Like, you want to have control over your school enrollments, like start having pro-fertility days in your small towns and start bumping up your school enrollments. Like, that is something you have control over, even though there are broader trends that kind of influence this as well. More recently, we have hospitals and birthing centers closed. So we do have these major structural challenges and things that happen in our small towns. Many times those things happen not because we have done something, but because we live in the modern world. So there really is this kind of idyllic notion of what rural is. And the number one thing people think about is agriculture. Like, I've done these studies with kids that I've taught in statistics classes at the community level. I mean, when I ask people, like, what is rural, the number one thing people think of is agriculture and farming. But today, less than 5% of all rural people are engaged in ag or an ag-related field. In fact, manufacturing has come and went as the primary industry as well. Today, the top industries in rural America are education and health services. They make up almost a third of all of our jobs in our rural communities. So really caring for people is our main job, right? But again, when you talk about how do we develop our rural communities, even the U.S. Department, or even the Office of Rural Development at the federal level, like rural development, how can we talk about developing our rural communities? Well, where is that organization housed nationally? Within the U.S. Department of Agriculture. So really, the whole framing issue really points us toward equating rural with agriculture. When for me, I am a non-agricultural rural sociologist. You want to know more about agriculture? Like, really go and ask all the ag folks. I'm here to talk about the diversity that we've got across our rural communities in terms of the economy, in terms of people, in terms of jobs. So this is a very different picture I want to paint for you. So before I get too far now, I just want to remind you that we've got chat here. If you've got any questions in your chat, we are monitoring this and we'll answer questions at the end. But if you have a question that you've got right now and you want to make sure that you don't lose it, please enter your question into chat. So really, I was asked to do a study by a foundation here in Minnesota to look at how do the metropolitan media in Minnesota portray our rural communities and our small towns. And one of the things that we looked at all these stories, and we do have a report up on that portrayal at the centerforsmalltowns.org. But one of the things that I did when I looked at how do the media portray rural, I asked reporters, what time of day did you go to our small towns to cover the story in Clarkfield or Ely or wherever it was? And the average time of day that reporters get into our small towns to cover stories, especially from the metropolitan areas, is between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. Well, you go into many of our small towns today, and what do you find there? You certainly don't find sleepy eye with filled main streets and people walking all over. People commute in and out all the time. Many of our small towns now, you have a majority of our population commuting out every day. So when a reporter may drive up and down Main Street, they don't really see anybody. They'll see a boarded up bank building. They'll see a boarded up school. They'll won't see many people. And it really just reaffirms this stereotype that rural is dying in this reporter's mind. And then they write about that, like there's, the small town is dying. You see this negative narrative persist through not just national media, but we tend to use it then ourselves. Like, I guess we are dying. Right. So one of the things I just want to point out here. So more recently, now we've had conversations for about 8 years about the post offices closing in our small towns. So one of the things that I had run across was a story where a reporter had went up to a small town over by Duluth, Minnesota, and had, interviewed like hundreds of people for this whole story. And then they focused on this one community of Calumet. And they ended up with a story of how is potentially closing the post office going to influence the community. So here's what ended up in the newspaper. The Iron Range town fighting for more than the mail. That was the headline. Great, not bad. Here's the byline. Calumet challenges a decision to close its post office, which is a social hub for its residents. And I was like, social hub? Like, I lived in Hancock, Minnesota for 12 years, a town of 700 people. And while I knew the postmaster, I didn't hang out in the post office. We didn't have coffee and donuts. And and this is kind of funny. Until you think now of how many people just read that. I just had here in Minnesota, 600,000 people read this. And now what do they think? They think people in this small town are hanging out in the post office. And this becomes impactful. This becomes a narrative that's written about us, but not by us. So really, what does this reporter do? They go to the common places, like, who do you find in our small towns when you travel to them in the morning and the afternoon? You certainly don't find the people who are working. You find the folks who are retired. And the folks who are retired will talk about where the town has been and what they used to be and what they had and what they could have had and what they should have had. And this, again, becomes a dominant narrative. So my point here is that rural areas are changing. They're certainly not dying. Many of these changes impact everybody. These are not unique to small towns and rural places. But I want to remind you that you're still here. Like, I wonder, if we talk about all these narratives about if we close our hardware store, our small town's going to die. We close our school, our small town's going to die. Show me all the dead towns. We should actually be patting ourselves on the back for the fact that you're still here. You have survived all of this massive restructuring. And you did it with volunteers, right? We don't have big paid staffs to deal with these structural changes like urban folks do, where they've got entire, agencies that deal with potential changes. We have volunteers. We have volunteer board members on your EDAs. We have volunteer citizen committees for extension. We have volunteer school boards. We have made it. We are still here. The research base does not support the notion that if something closes, your town is going to die. So what has been going on? Let's get to the narrative now. So again, I want to give you ammo. My last name is Winchester, right? So I'm going to give you ammo for how to have a positive narrative in your rural communities. And we're going to start with this. The rural population in America has not gone down. In fact, since 1970, the rural population has increased by 11%. What's gone down is the relative percentage of Americans that live in rural places. So in 1970, 1 in 4 people, right? Well, 26%, about 1 in 4 people live in small towns and rural places. But by 2010, that number went down to 1 in 5. And how can that be, right? I thought the rural population went up. Yep. While the rural population, this part of the red part of the pie got bigger, it didn't get as big as fast as urban America did. So while rural America grew at 11%, urban America grew at 48%. So now this leads to a relative percentage decline. But this is almost always the headline you see. People prefer urban living is the direct line you get out of this, and they're wrong. In fact, people still prefer rural living, but our urban areas are growing. At the same time, many of our urban areas many of our rural areas are so interesting and demanded by people that they become urbanized. In Iowa, 473,000 people today live in places that were considered rural in 1974. So really, and when you look at this, like how big was the MSA, the metropolitan area around Des Moines and other mini metropolitan areas across the state, like you've added like a number, this is true. Let me just step back. This is true for all metropolitan areas in the country, is what's called a concentric ring growth. So in the 1920s and 30s, you had core urban areas, but people didn't want to live there anymore, so they moved out, and they created the first ring suburbs. And then in the 70s and 80s, people who lived in the core metro were like, well, I don't want to live here anymore, and I want to live in a less dense environment. So they looked out to the first ring suburbs, and they're like, well, I don't know, that's pretty urban, so they move out to the second ring suburbs. This is how many of our rural communities become urbanized. And what happens now is it looks like our rural population went down. Really, my rural people just got taken away from me. Like really, we just reclassified 5 counties from rural to urban. It's not that everybody moved into urban areas. It's that urban areas have grown and taken over many of our rural communities. In fact, 21% of all counties in the United States have been reclassified from non-metro to metro, which are now home to 36 million people. You're welcome, urbanity. I'm glad you love living in our rural places, so much so that they become urbanized, and that becomes a point of friction too, right? So anyway, these are some of the influences on the data side that tend to really aggravate that narrative. But I want to step back and just say, well, okay, if rural is dying, then why can't I find a house to buy? Like, this was the first question I had. Like, don't we have a workforce housing shortage? Like, right? If we're all dying, we should have homes like all over the place. So I want to introduce a term to you called total population infatuation. And this one is about, we tend to use total population as an indicator for success or failure. And if our population went up, we're a winner. And if it goes down, we're a big loser, right? Counties in white across the Great Plains. If your population went down, you're in white and you're a big loser. Right? I mean, I'm saying this tongue in cheek. I hope you know that, right? But really, we tend to use this all the time that, if we're not winning, we're losing. But wait, the first time I kind of saw this trend was a 5-county region in western Minnesota. These are, decent sized counties here, between 9,000 to 15,000 people. Their population went down by 35% since 1960. To 2010. That's the narrative, right? Total population to decline. But if you look at the number of households, the number of households went up by 3%. How can that be? How can your population go down, but your households go up? The average household size has gone down. So when the average number of people per household goes down, you're going to end up over time with fewer people in your community. And that's not because people are moving out, it's because of household structure. So really in 1940, the average household size was 3.6. But by 2018, now we're down to 2.6. You're going to lose 29% of your population by doing nothing except existing in the modern world. But you also have other influences here. What happens when your kids graduate? Well, your population just went down by 2, but your households stayed the same. Today, we have a situation where we have 2 senior spouses in a home. One of them passes away. What happens then to that surviving spouse? They more than likely stay in that house, right? But your population just went down by 1 now, but your household stayed the same. We have a higher proportion of people that are over the age of 70 in our rural communities, and we're going to continue to see this trend. So if your population is going down today, it's most likely because of this. Not because everybody of all ages are all moving out. We'll look at this in a minute. But really, this is demographic destiny that you're going to lose people. So Louisa, you lost 7% of your population between 2000 and 2010. We're going to have new data coming out here pretty quick. But the number of housing units only went down by 3%. Like, here's the narrative, right? Loser, tongue in cheek. But like, your housing units are much more stable. Muscatine, your population went up by 2%, but housing units went up by 7%. Des Moines County and all these surrounding counties around you all there. Again, when you look at the kind of disconnect between Henry is a loser here, but really they remain stable. And stable for me does not mean stagnant. So I want to start to better understand who is really moving in and who's moving out. And what we do know is that every 5 years, pre-pandemic, every 5 years, which, people are starting to move again, interest rates are very low, but every 5 years, about 44% of all households in the state of Iowa move. You may move across town, or you may move out to the country or to a different city or state or country, right? But the point is, we're a highly mobile population. So when we look at any given rural community, and here's a very typical community, and I don't have profiles for everybody here, but I just want to paint this picture of what happens to your population between any 2 time periods. Here is the brain drain. So here in Grant County, Minnesota, they lost 43% of their young people after graduation. But when I first made these charts, I was like, wait a minute, it looks like there's people in their 30s, 40s, and 50s moving in to these communities. Here is the narrative. In fact, there are dozens of books, hundreds of journal articles about this. And then when I started to analyze the data, I also found this. Now there's people moving in. So what did I do? I wanted to see who else is writing about this, who else is talking about this. And what did I find? Almost nothing. And it was quite discouraging, because this to me was super news. Like, isn't this great news? We got people in their 30s moving in, and you also have 10 to 14-year-olds moving in, and they're not moving alone. I mean, they're coming with their parents right here. So we end up with a typical profile of rural prairie counties. You guys are in this with us, and somewhat balanced between rural prairie and rural recreational, which you'll see in a minute. But we end up with a brain drain, right? This is typical of rural prairie counties. But we also have a brain gain, where this cohort of people in their 30s and 40s grew, and they're bringing their kids. Rural recreational counties, they also see a brain drain, not as large, but they also see great gains in population in their 30s, 40s, and now into the 50s and 60s. Core metropolitan counties. Here's Des Moines, the core, not Des Moines County, sorry, the city of Des Moines, and the metropolitan area more specifically. Like, where do the young people go to? Metropolitan counties. But more interesting that I found here was that after the age of 30, people don't stick around the metros. They actually move out to the suburbs and to rural places. So we started to do research on this. We literally found thousands of newcomers across the country, and we wanted to better understand like who's moving in and who's moving out. But more specifically, who's moving in? Why are they moving in? What kind of jobs do they have? What kind of life do they have? And we asked newcomers, and so we did these surveys and focus groups and interviews. And we asked newcomers, why did you move to our small towns? And the top 3 reasons that people gave were, number 1 was a simpler pace of life. Number 2 is safety and security, and that's especially high with people with kids. And number 3 was the low cost of housing. Now, nowhere in the top 10 in Minnesota and top 5 in Nebraska was a job. Right? We did more detail on this, and we asked, when we kind of detail and drill down into the reasons why people made the move, just 31% of newcomers said they moved for a job. Now, economic developers tend to have a job first approach that, if we don't have jobs, nobody's going to want to live here. When in fact, when we ask people like, did you have a job offer or have a job? They're like, no, we moved for all these other reasons. And then I started to look for a job. So it's not to say that people don't need a job, but it's not the primary reason why they make the move. We also found that just 25% of newcomers had lived there before. This totally shocked us because we thought a lot of the new people moving to our rural communities were going to be kids that grew up there, moved away, and came back. And what we find is that's just true for 1 in 4 people. The other 3 in 4 people have not lived there before. And if you know anything about moving, and we've got a newcomer panel. We got a panel of people who are new movers to your community in the past roughly 5 years. And we're going to hear right from them about what it was like. But what we gathered in this data here is that just 25% that lived there before, and put yourselves into their shoes, right? If you're from there and your plumbing pipe bursts at 1 a.m., if you're from there, you're going to call your uncle and be like, hey, uncle, I have a problem with my pipe. But imagine if you don't know anybody in town. Like, who do you go to? Do you just randomly call some Google search, right? Or, what type of contact do newcomers have with your community becomes a paramount question for me. What type of experience do your newcomers have? Are they welcomed in, or is the first thing they hear is, why did you move here? As if you can't believe why anybody would actually choose to move to your community, right? So really, this becomes fascinating. 91% of newcomers have college or a bachelor's degree. 75% have household incomes over $50,000. 47% have children in their household, which we thought that was going to be much higher. Newcomer households with kids, I think, are easier to see because it's like, hey, there's a new kid in my kid's class, and oh, there's their parents, right? But I'll just remind you that every time you see a newcomer household with kids, there's another newcomer household that doesn't have kids. And it's very difficult to see these newcomers. You could literally be pumping gas next to your neighbor and you wouldn't know it. And why is that? Because we don't typically have opportunities for welcoming like we used to, right? We don't have welcome wagons like we used to because the post office can't just hand out a list of all the new people and their phone numbers, right? We're in an area of privacy. So there are some, additional considerations we need to have here. We also found that 14% telecommute. Now, this study was just done last year. So this is pre-pandemic. Now imagine where those telecommuting numbers are going to be here today. So when we ask people, what were factors in why you made the move to this community? So take advantage of the slower pace of life, right? Live closer to relatives. I want to put an asterisk next to this, and that means that doesn't always mean people want to live in the town where their relatives are, but I want to live in the area where my relatives live. Like my relatives live in the next town over. It's almost like they want to live closer to relatives, but sometimes not too close, right? I mean, it was kind of comical actually to go through all this research. Other people want to find a less congested place to live among people with similar values. And that doesn't mean political values. That thing is around appreciation for the environment, the outdoors, wanting to play and recreate, right? Find lower priced housing, safer place to live, right? All of these reasons. We're going to get this PowerPoint out to you. So if you want to look through this in more detail, you'll have the opportunity to do so. Now, one of the questions we asked was, do you believe the community you moved to was welcoming when you moved here? And then we patterned that off to be a predictor because there's another question about, are you likely to live here in 5 years? And for the people that did not believe, that believe the community was not welcoming, just 44% of people say that they expect to be there in 5 years. You look at this direct relationship between how welcoming a community is and then whether or not the people actually believe they're going to live there in 5 years. So this is a retention issue, right? So now if you're going to be welcoming in new people, like, we want to do it right. So I just want to step back again and remind you that people are moving all the time. Your kids graduate, they may move to the metro or college or whatever, meet a spouse, or a partner, they move. Some people have kids, they move. Like, on average, Americans move 12 times during their lifetime. Newcomer, I'm defining as people who moved in the past 5 years. Generally, that was how we define them in our sample. And the distance thing doesn't matter to us. The minimum level we go here is the county level. And it's not just people who didn't live in the town previously. Jessica, I saw your question there. We're including everybody. You could be considered a transplant if you are from a whole different place. If you've never lived in the community, but now you live in this community, you're considered a transplant. But if you went away and came back, you're called a returnee or a boomeranger at times. There's a bunch of different language for that. They're all considered newcomers, because many times when you left as an 18-year-old, you come back as a 34-year-old, it's a very different experience for you. So we'll talk about that in a little bit here too. You'll actually hear from some of these folks. So the bottom line is people are choosing to move into your rural community. And I want to call this the brain gain, because again, you got people in their 30s and 40s moving in. They're in their prime earning years. They've got education, networks, right? They've got experience. So, I mean, I don't want to continue to use the term brain drain, because what are you talking about? A high school kid who doesn't have very much education? You got a high school education, right? They don't really have worldly experience or, any experience with regard to a job or whatnot. So I want to move away from using that negative language around brain drain and just counter it with a topic around the brain gain. People in this is very true for people in their 30s and 40s and almost 98% of all rural counties in the country. We also have a trend of people in their 50s and 60s moving in, but it's not nearly as widespread. And really, newcomers don't just look at your town. They don't just look at the town they ended up in. Many times they look at 3 to 5 communities and they draw this big triangle and be like, I want to move between here and here and here. Like, while we like to think our town is the end all be all for what people choose, this isn't 1910 where we have no opportunities to get out. We live in these vast regions. We live in the middle of everywhere. And we'll talk about this not just here today, but in the next webinar in 2 weeks. At the same time, we have a very diverse economy in rural America. We did research here at the University of Minnesota that shows, like, I think there's an idea that everybody's a farmer or whatnot, or that I could never be a book editor in rural Minnesota. I could never be a doctor, right? Well, what we would find is that you're right. In any one town, we don't have a diverse economy. But when you start to put 3 to 5 rural counties together, which is about the same size as a metro, you have the same composition, diversity of composition of jobs and employment and income that you do in the urban areas. So now, before you say like, well, we never have professional jobs out here, you can really fill in the blank with, you can be a book editor in rural Iowa, you can be an engineer in rural Iowa, you can be a modern farmer in rural Iowa. You all know, if those of you that are engaged in ag or ag-related fields, it's very technological. This isn't like 1910. Again, we're very modern. The idea that rural areas are all being left behind is antiquated. Like, it doesn't take 5 years for a trend from the metro to reach rural America like it did in 1870. I mean, we have the internet here today. We find out about things like 22 seconds later. So I just want to get past some of these myths that rural areas are just these places left behind and just, anyway. We also have a lot of people that travel in and out of your communities every day. So here in Muscatine, every day, 10,000 people commute into the county for a job. Every day, 7,200 residents commute out for a job in a neighboring community, and 9,700 people both live and work in the county. In Louisa, again, very similar trends of a lot of people in and out of your community. 3,000 people commuting out every day, 1,700 people commuting in every day. And we have to be okay with both of these, right? Some people don't always want to live in your county because households hedge their economic bets. Like, I don't want to live in Muscatine because my wife's got a job in Des Moines. Like, we want to live more in between. But I commute in every day. But I also want to ask you, Of those 10,000 people that commute in every day in Muscatine and 1,700 that commute in every day into Louisa, how are they ever included in our community planning? Like, I'm a community developer. I do lots of visioning and community planning work. And who do you tend to include when you do community visioning? The people that live there. Well, okay, that's these people right here, 16,000 here and 4,100, 4,200 people here. But you've also got 10,000 people here and 1,700 people that every day call your community home. And I will advocate for you to see them, to include them, include their voices, because you may be able to translate them into full-time residents at some point. But more importantly, we want to embrace everybody who calls this place home, whether or not they actually have a home here. But I would argue that people who work there every day also should have a voice. So really, I just want to talk about how people actually live in the middle of everywhere. Like, where you put your home is one place, but you live, play, recreate, shop, eat out in this vast region. Nobody lives and works and shops and plays in just one small town, right? Again, this is 1870. Like, we've got this vast network. We've got cars. We're a very transportation mobile area in our rural communities. So we're going to look at in more detail at some of these trends in 2 weeks. So I hope you're able to sign up for that event and participate then. So the other piece is this is about leadership. It's like, where are these people becoming involved? And I thought social life is dying. So again, the narrative here is that social life is dying. People don't care about their community. And I would hear early on through all this newcomer research I did, when I would present this, the local leaders would say, well, if there's all these new people here, where are they? They're not part of my community. I don't think they really care about, this community. Well, okay, if they didn't care, then we should be able to see a decline in civic engagement. But in fact, when I look at data from the National Center for Charitable Statistics, I find that the number of nonprofits grows at a pretty good rate in almost all of the rural counties across this country. In Iowa, even though the county was relatively stable in terms of population gains of just 4%, the number of nonprofits went up by 12%. Even the most rural counties in the state that lost 7% of their population saw the number of nonprofits go up by 12%. So when you look at a map of nonprofit changes, because I like to use nonprofits because nonprofits don't pop up for no reason. People have to create them. And they create them when they find enough people with similar interests and they want to serve a need or an interest or fulfill themselves. So creating a nonprofit is actually kind of hard. You have to hire people. You have to file incorporation papers. You have to, or not hire people, but hire a lawyer a lot of times to do that paperwork. You have to find board members, right? It's a lot of work. Well, between 2000 and 2010, the number of nonprofits went up by 11 and 25%. So in Louisa County, while the population went down by 7%, the number of nonprofits went up by 25%. That's not the story of civic decline, but really, where are these people involved? And that becomes another question. Muscatine County, your population went up by 2%, but the number of nonprofits went up by 11%. Now I'm going to jump back and just point out one thing. Again, you can look at detail on this when you've got some time here, but I want to point out one thing, and that's the number of organizations that file 990s. Now, nonprofits file 990s when they have revenues of $50,000 or more. When you look at the proportion of nonprofits that file 990s, right, it's less than 20% in 2000, but it's almost 50% of your nonprofits in 2010 are filing 990s. Your revenues have gone up, your assets have gone up. Muscatine, relatively the same proportion here, like 33% were filed 990s in 2000, and now you're on almost 60% here that file 990s. You've got some changes in revenue too, like there must have been a large grant or something maybe one of these years. But overall, the assets of your nonprofit sectors have gone up significantly. And assets for me are the real viable source of long-term sustainability. Assets for me are indications of civic investment, social investment that people make in your nonprofit sector. While I can't invest in Hardware Hank on Main Street, I can certainly invest in my Eagles Club, my Lions Club, my Red Cross, and build the assets of these groups. But meanwhile, we tend to have a negative narrative when it comes to these young people moving in. And when I don't see them at my meeting, it's like, well, they don't care about this town. We have a terrible narrative about our young people. Right. And this isn't new. And I would just want to show you that. Look at the covers of, New Yorker, Life, Time Magazine, the Me Decade, 1990, Generational Warfare, 96. It's all about me in 07, the Me Generation, 2013. Like, being interested and selfish is not a trait of a specific generation. It's a trait of an age. So really, I want to remind you, y'all baby boomers that are in the audience here, what names were you called, right? When you were younger, and now we're doing it today. What do we call these young millennials and younger people now? Entitled, lazy. I mean, like, oh my God, this drives me crazy. Please don't ever use words like that, because we did this to our kids 25, 30 years ago. Boomers were called this too. Don't continue this negative narrative about where you believe and speculate that these young people's interests lie. When people are concerned about themselves, and like the me generation, that's what all 18-year-olds are. They're all concerned about themselves. But by the time they hit the age of 30, you tend to have a different mindset. What has changed dramatically is how people are involved. And so take note of this. Historically, people would be involved in place-based groups with a broad focus. So like the Hancock Community Betterment Club. People would be involved in that group, and they would help not anybody outside of Hancock, but they would help anybody in town that needed help, from the chamber group to the church need to build something new, to the school wanting to build a new park or whatever it was. It was a narrow geography with a broad focus, where today people want to be involved in just the opposite. Broad geographies with a narrow focus. The Northeast Iowa Bicycle Association, right? Like, these groups are vast. This group covers 12 counties, and they don't do everything. They don't have a broad focus. They have a narrow focus. They bicycle, and they may also raise money for cancer. They may also like do something else, but the primary reason for engagement is not the place. It is the interest. And so now if you all community developers, I know we've got lots of community leaders on here, we need to find ways to reach out to these groups and bridge them, is what it's called. We need to do bridging capital work between the old established groups, who now struggle because they can't find a way to include these new groups, or they don't even know where these new groups are, or that they even exist. So this becomes community development work that you can work on in the future to help bridge these differences between generations. So there really are opportunities for engagement here. I need to say that new residents are more than warm bodies. A lot of times if there's new people in town, you're like, hey, you want to join the EDA board? You're like, I don't know. I don't know anything about economics. Like, why did you invite that person to participate? It's because they were a warm body and you had an empty seat. Well, we need to actually find out who these people are. And I'm going to advocate for a model of respect and inquiry when it comes to newcomers, because we don't actually ask them what they love about the town. What do they do civically? Where were you before? What type of skills do you have? It's, why would you move here? Or do you want to join our board? But no questions ever are arising around their own interest. So we really, if you do want to involve people, we really say it's got to start with a small request. Be like, hey, we're going to flip burgers for the firemen on Saturday morning. Do you want, or Saturday night? Do you want to help us out? Right. And that's an easy way in. You're not asking them for money. You're not asking them to sit on a board. So really our key here is engagement needs to happen before leadership. Rich, you had the question there about 2000, 2010. I think you're asking about the nonprofit numbers. Great question. There's a reason why I didn't go from 2010 to 2020. It's because the number of nonprofits in this country went down by 12% between 2011 and 2014 because they cleaned up their database and got rid of all these like dead organizations. So really it looks like a reduction in the number of nonprofits when it's only an artifact of cleaning up their data. We do know that the trends continued upward of anywhere between 5 to 10% growth in the nonprofit sector since 2016, when the kind of great cleanse was over. So I hope that answers that question. So let's get back to the narrative. The Pew Research Institute in 2009, I want to just point that out, this was 11 years ago. They asked Americans, they do a lot of polling of American preferences and opinions. They're very popular. And so while we know that 80% of Americans live in a city, when Pew asked all Americans, like, if you could live wherever you wanted, where would you like to live? 51% of Americans said they prefer to live in small towns and rural places. Well, I mean, did we even know this? Like, that seems like a big number. That seems like good news for our small towns. Now, so there is this renewed interest recently in rural, but this interest is not new. So I just want to step back here. So there has been demand for rural and small town living, and this has been happening not just since I published my work like 15 years ago. The trend around this brain gain of people moving into our rural communities has been around since the 1970s. It's not new. There are actually a lot of people that have been moving into our rural communities. In fact, the 90s had so many people move out to rural America, it filled up almost all of your vacant homes, which now has led to that workforce housing shortage that you are, I'm sure, well aware of that we had just 9 months ago. We had workforce housing shortage. Why is that? We're going to talk in much more detail about this, but at the end of this statement, you can't say you don't see this coming. I want you to prepare for the largest demographic change that you've ever witnessed in your community and rural America's ever witnessed since the 1930s when we mechanized agriculture. And that is 75% of our rural homeowners are baby boomers and older. And today, 30% of your homeowners in your county are over the age of 75. This generation of seniors staying in their homes actually inhibits the ability of people to move in. How can you welcome people to move in if you have nowhere for them to live? This is a very basic question. But we also know that the senior generation today is staying in their home longer than any other previous generation at that age ever existed. Almost threefold. It used to be like 8% of seniors would stay in their home by the time they got to this age. And now we're at like 40%, 50%. This becomes a model that we need to better examine. This will be the third webinar we have, which is on rural housing, the future of our rural communities as viewed through housing. That one's going to be on December 4th. So I want to talk about a model of what I call resident recruitment. And this model we have started to flesh out over the past couple of years. We've had a tight labor market, we had workforce housing shortages, and then the pandemic hit. But I want to let you know that resident recruitment is here to complement industrial recruitment. So when we're actually trying to welcome people in, we need to involve community developers, we need to involve economic developers and tourism, because we do know that tourism translates into resident recruitment. Not always. Your tourists actually have to have a positive experience in your rural community, right? One of the things I like to do whenever I visit a small town is to go to the gas station. You go to the gas station and I ask like, hey, what's fun to do around here? And the number one answer I get is nothing. Because who tends to, I got like some high school kid working there, or you go to the same story with hotel and motels too. I ask them what's there to do around here, and they point me at a stack of brochures off on the side. Right? There's actually no positive narrative that's being explicitly portrayed by people on the front lines. And this is what I talk about with regards to tourism. We're going to dig into all of these concepts more on the webinar in 2 weeks. So what kind of narrative do you have? I just want to say it this way. If you have a negative narrative in your town, talking about the best days are behind us, there's nothing here for you, nobody wants to live here, the number one audience for your negative narrative are your kids. They hear it all the time. These are my kids. They know what the word narrative means. And if they hear this and they think that there's nothing here for them, they're never going to come back. Like, we have to be okay with them, wanting to leave, but we need to let them know there's actually a viable future for them, because you actually do have people that have moved back and they're not failures. I do know from the interviews and focus groups we have done that many times when newcomers that are from the community move back, they end up engaging in conversations all the time about, I'm not failing because I came back. I'm not failing because I want to help my family out or take care of my grandparents, right? These are actually very valid reasons for people to move back, and they are the number one resource for the future of our community. And if we don't see these people, if you don't go out of your way to actually make this a welcoming experience for people, they're not going to ever stay. So meanwhile, I want to remind you that this is getting to be winter. And when newcomers move in, you may not even see them, especially during winter when it's dark when you get up in the morning and dark when you get home. Like, you don't even know if new people moved in across the street until the spring. And they're like, oh, I thought John lived there. And like, no, there's a woman living there. Like, who are these people, right? I mean, it's kind of tongue-in-cheek here again, but the idea is that we don't know our newcomers. We don't explicitly know how to find them. And these are the topics that we've got for our resident recruitment webinar in 2 weeks. So the bottom line here is newcomers are moving in and have been moving in since the 70s. They're creating groups in terms of nonprofits. They're building their community. They're diversifying the economy. They're buying and starting businesses. We've actually done research at the University of Minnesota around business succession. Like, you actually have a lot of businesses ready to turn over I think it's something like 60% of your business owners or managers are 55 and older. They're going to want to turn these businesses over. So when we portray this to the broader world, like, hey, we've got businesses for sale, it's not like, hey, come in and help out our dying businesses. Like, who's ready to throw away their family fortune by buying my apothecary? Right? I mean, that's not true. The businesses that we've got in our rural communities today are stronger than ever. They have weathered all the economic storms that we've been through over the past 25 years. This is an opportunity for us to have a positive narrative and to build our communities. Some people are working from home. They're living in a region. There's certainly more than warm bodies. And so really there is a rural choice. The bottom line is people want to live and move to your communities for what you are today and will be tomorrow, not what may have been. I want to remind you that of the thousands of focus groups and surveys I've done, if you've got a negative narrative, I don't see it in the reasons why people move. Nobody ever says they're moving to your town for pity. Like, you know what, Hancock, I know you lost your grocery store 26 years ago. I'm here to help you out today. Like, nobody ever says that, right? I have motivations internally. If we don't better understand why people are making the move, the narrative in your town is going to actually turn so many people off. So hopefully, the information you've seen here today has been consumable, understandable. If you've got questions, we got probably 5 minutes here. If you want to put those in the chat, and then we're going to move on. We've got a panel of 4 here today to talk about their experience. And so with that, I'll open this up for questions.
Ben, this is Charlotte. First, your children are adorable. What good-looking guys. One of the questions that's come in is give examples of how others have improved the narrative, both for their community and for young people within their community.
Right, great question. So we will talk about this more in the next webinar too, but I will give you a quick some sneak peeks here. One of the things we like to do is have a newcomer supper, and one of the reasons why we do this, we call it the best $150 ever spent, and it's a newcomer supper, and it's only for newcomers. It is not for the broader community to stand around and gawk at all the new people in town. It is there just for newcomers, and the number one outcome out of this is newcomers saying, man, I can't believe how many other new people there are. I can't tell you how rewarding that is for people to not feel like they're on an island anymore. At the same time, we can do things like retweet visitors saying how much they love the community. Otter Tail County, we have in Otter Tail County, you'll hear more about this in 2 weeks. Well, we have the nation's first resident recruitment coordinator. I think they call it the rural rebound coordinator. It's his job to help take newcomers out to lunch. It's to retweet visitors, because visitors are like, man, I can't believe the local people actually saw me online, right? Other things you can do is to ensure that we're doing more when we're trying to show off our community than just the job. Because when new people are coming to visit our community, they're looking for more than just the job. Because you saw all those reasons why people make the move. It's more than just the job. We also have seen episodes where local newspapers have done things like they started a brain gain corner, where they highlight a story of a newcomer family every week. And this lets people see there is always change. Your communities are always changing. And when you can put a face to it and be like, oh, now when I'm pumping gas next to Jan that I see in the newspaper, I'm going to know she's new here, right? And I'm going to say hi to her. But meanwhile, if I didn't know she was new here, I'd think she was just getting gas and going on her way. So the last thing I want to say is one of the other pieces I like to hit on here is, especially with the young people, is we've seen this happen in a number of communities, is where we have a newcomer supper. Have a couple high school kids with an iPad or a video camera, set up a little table, and then invite the newcomers, 1 or 2 at a time or family at a time, and videotape them and ask those newcomers, what do you love about this community? And one of the outcomes here is not gathering information about what everybody loves, but having the kids actually hear this, that there are people that love this place. I don't ever hear this at home. Like, I didn't know people love this place. I mean, this is profound for the young people, especially when they may hear nothing good about your place. So this is why, again, we have the panelists here today, is because you have people here today that are gonna share their voice about what they love about this community as well.
Thank you. Another question that came in is, what is the biggest change outside of housing needs that you anticipate in the next 10 years for rural communities?
Well, I think broadband. Broadband being seen as a necessary part. I think many of our rural communities actually have very good broadband. So, there is a narrative out there that rural doesn't have broadband. But I'll tell you, like, we've got rural co-ops that laid fiber to the farm like 10 years ago. So in many places, we do have more than adequate internet there. It is becoming top choice why people make the move. So the way I've seen the changes in broadband is, 5-7 years ago, broadband wasn't really seen as something people had to, make sure of, right? Where today people do look for broadband, that we need to have this. But there's one more nuance to this, and that's this. Don't use a catch-all term like broadband, because broadband sometimes just means your download is really high. Where I want to talk about being able to download and upload. Now, upstream is when you create things and you need to upload them to the internet. Downstream is consumption, right? If I'm consuming internet, I'm a full-time consumer. Right? I'm consuming Netflix, I'm consuming whatever. But if you don't have a decent upstream, you cannot be an economic producer in this economy. So usually people just use the term broadband and use it as a catch-all. But hopefully I've given you a little bit of language around download and upload, because if your upload is terrible, good luck trying to find people who want to hire me, because I need to upload 1.2 gig data files every day. And sometimes if I'm in even today in the town I live in, my upstream is fairly terrible. So many times when I need to do my upload, you all remember dial-up days when you would start the upload or the download at night and then you'd go to bed and then you'd wake up in the morning and be like, well, I hope it didn't break. Well, it's kind of like that, right? So just want to advocate for broadband as a necessary service as we move forward. So housing and broadband are number 1 and 2 for me as we talk about the future of our towns.
Another question, we're seeing more and more families of international background move to our communities. How do we engage them better?
Yeah, I think, again, just listening, opening our ears. So rather than telling people, I think there's a friction point here, right? Because I would hear a lot of times, like, when are these new people going to learn about our culture? Okay, this is a very divisive issue at this point, because yes, there is a culture that exists in your community. In fact, I would argue there are multiple cultures that exist in your community, and the cultures that you have today look very different than the cultures you had 80 years ago, right? We have ethnic changes, we have ancestral changes, you have religious changes that you witnessed in our rural communities. But it is about, when you are a welcoming community, you will dedicate yourselves to listening. You dedicate yourselves to building, you dedicate yourselves to a forward-looking perception of what you've got. Where I think a lot of times people look to our rural communities and say, well, you're not very diverse, like people must not want to live there. The lack of diversity in our rural communities is not an outcome. It's an artifact of the fact that we don't have many homes for sale. It's hard to welcome in diversity when you've honestly got nowhere for them to live, right? Minnesota is very similar to Iowa in this respect. A majority of the ethnic immigration we've experienced here in Minnesota is in the regional centers with food processors. It is slowly starting to trickle out to our other small towns and rural communities, but it's not prevalent. But I think my major message here is that the lack of diversity is not an outcome, it's an artifact. And as you see on that housing piece, like 75% of our homes are going to turn over. Those people moving in are not always going to look like the people that currently live there. So the future of our rural community starts today.
One more question. What causes young people to first choose to move? And have you seen communities that were more successful in hanging on to them? And I know you addressed a couple of things in an earlier answer, but if you don't mind addressing that.
There's a lot of different reasons. Like people move to different places for different reasons. So you kind of have to find out your exact reasoning, but they're all under this umbrella that I'd mentioned earlier about slower pace of life, outdoor recreation, amenities, things like that. So part of this, we're actually going to cover some of this in the second one, which is how do you let people know what you've got in your region? And if a lot of times I can pick up a marketing brochure for a small town, and I can tell you exactly how old the people were that wrote that, right? And so we have to be very careful about how are we talking about the resources that we've got or the assets that we've got in our community. If we're very parochial about this, we only talk about what we have in town. But in fact, when we look at how big of a region people live in, it's vast. It's like 5 to 7 counties out. So if you can't name off things that people are doing in the region, how can you market yourself truly? If you are, I mean, if you can't market anything around you, you really do live in the middle of nowhere. Like, you should be portraying yourself as living in the middle of everywhere. Not only do we have this, but immediately around us, we have all these other things. So there aren't major differentials. I think the key thing for me is if those young people, newcomers hear anything about derogatory language, if they hear anything about how they're entitled, like, that is an immediate turnoff for people. Not just, I mean, I just want to say again, I advocate for respect and listening when it comes to new people in, because they will give you the path forward. They're going to tell you how it went, warts and all, with regards to your community, if you really want to hear them. So,
thank you, Ben. Those were the questions that we had. I appreciate it.
Right. So with that, I know Lewis is not here. We do have 4 panelists here today, everyone. I think we'll invite them to turn their cameras on at this point, I believe. So we've got Jessica, Jennifer, Lupita, and Tiffany here today. We're going to start off this. I think everybody's on here. Can somebody give me the yay or nay on, are they on here? Let me see this. Lupita, Jessica. So Jennifer, are you here? Jessica.
Yes, all of our panelists are here. I believe their video is getting turned on right now. And
great.
So,
Jessica, do a little mic test. Hello. You're muted.
Hello.
Hello.
You
Great.
hear me now? Hi.
Yeah, real good. Thank you. Lupita, hello.
hello.
And Tiffany, hello.
Hello.
Oh, there you are. And Jenny is also muted.
Hello.
Hi, Jenny. Well, great. Just want to say thank you, everyone. So we're here for the second part of the program, which really my strategy here is, it's one thing to hear from Ben Winchester, but yeah, I don't know if it's true here, right? Or I don't really know if that really happened in my community. We've got 4 folks here to share their story about their experience, not just moving in, about the choices they made, kind of how it's going. So I just want to say welcome to the panelists, and thank you for opening yourselves up here today and the opportunity that you're giving everybody else to kind of hear your story. And I just want to start off with this. We're going to kind of go down through the list, and I just want to invite each of you briefly to introduce yourself. Who are you, your family, and when did you move here, and kind of what do you do? So we'll start with Jennifer.
So my name's Jennifer Learness. I'm the Resource Development Officer at Muscatine Center for Social Action. I live here in town with my fiance, and he from Bellingham, Washington in 2018. So I've been here for about 2.5 years.
All right, kind of sketchy on your internet there, Jenny. You kind of gapped out there on the last half. Could you just repeat the last little bit? Sorry.
Sure. I moved to Muscatine, Iowa from Bellingham, Washington about 2.5 years ago.
Thank you. Jessica.
Hi, my name is Jessica Susie. I moved to Muscatine a little over 4 years ago in August of 2016. I'm here with my husband and my 5-year-old daughter. I work for a law firm in West Des Moines. I'm a patent and trademark attorney. My husband works for H&I, and yeah, I've been here for a little over 4 years.
Super, thank you. Lupita.
Hi, my name is Lupita Saucedo. I moved here in mid-November 2016. I'm currently a community liaison with West Liberty High School. So if you hear the bell ringing in the background, it's the bell ringing as kids are zooming back and forth. My work has been primarily chasing after homework and food, clothing, shelter, those kinds of basic needs, and helping kids be able to surpass some of the difficulties of at-risk families trying to navigate through the differences of culture and coming to the community in West Liberty, as well as the surrounding area of kids that are going to Nichols and I want to say it's Nichols and the Louisa area. Some of the students that we have are just in the outskirts of West Liberty too.
Great, thank you. Tiffany.
Hi, my name's Tiffany Briggs. I moved here just about a year ago. About the 4th week of November, I moved to Louisa County. I moved here because I work for the Kent Nutrition Group, and I had worked for them for 22 years on the East Coast in various positions. And it really, if I wanted to try something different for them, I really needed to move to this area. I have a daughter who is 17 years old. She is a junior at L&M High School. She moved with me here last January, so about 6 weeks before COVID really changed everyone's lives forever. My other daughter was attending college for an ag business degree in New York, and she came to move with us in March. We did not expect her to be moving that soon with us. And my husband actually is still on the East Coast, and hopefully he will be here with us by the end of January. He's been hoping for a job transfer for the past year. We lived about 2 hours outside of Boston, about an hour and 15 minutes from the ocean. So, you know, we definitely could travel into the city if we wanted to experience that type of lifestyle whenever we wanted to.
Great, thank you. Tiffany, I'll just go right to you with our first question. So FYI, folks, everybody in the audience here, if you've got any questions, I've got a couple of questions we're going to go through here with the panelists. But if you've got a question for the panelists, you want to just throw that in the chat now before you forget it, please do so. We'll make sure to get it here. So Tiffany, the first question for the panel as a whole, but Tiffany, your response first. In the year before your move, kind of what turned your attention to moving to the area in the first place? What were you looking for? Were there things that were pushing you away from there or pulling you into here?
Well, the community we came from is very similar to Louisa County. We lived in a town of 700 people. We could commute into town within 15 minutes. We were probably in the 4th or 5th largest city in New Hampshire. You know, all the shopping, anything that you needed was available there. So almost kind of like Muscatine, just I have a half an hour commute now instead of a 10 to 15 minute commute. A little more chain restaurants, a little more chain shopping was available there. So really it was my career that brought us here. My husband had actually taken a job with a company that had a headquarters in Iowa City 2 years ago, because we felt that if I was going to, you know, continue in my career, that we were probably going to need to come to the Muscatine area. A little unique, we had been looking at property here for about 4 years, and we kind of fell into a nice situation. Our daughter showed livestock on the East Coast, so we knew we needed some acreage. And it was really kind of tough to find something that was, you know, 5 to 12, 15 acres. And we found a family that was going to be moving, and they let us know about their situation before they put their house on the market. So we were able to purchase a house. They lived there for a year before they were ready to move. And then the house was empty for a few months, and then I had the opportunity to move to this area.
Super, thank you, Tiffany. Lupita, same question. In the year before you moved here, what kind of turned your attention to the area? Were there things that were pushing you away there and things pushing or pulling you into here?
Well, I had made the choice. My family had asked me to come back home, and so it's kind of a luxury to just stop everything and return back to Iowa. My life just changed. It was a year before. I had no clue that I was going to be coming here. It was an accident that my oldest brother had, and my little brother and an older sister asked me to come back home if it was possible. And so it was something that I didn't plan on, but I knew that I was going to be closer to my elderly parents. Mom is 79, Dad is 80, and my brother is so much better now. But you know, you're coming back home. Yeah. This is after almost 25, 30 years. You know, my life has been in Minnesota. It's very, very different. I didn't expect to be here, but I'm glad to be here.
Great, thank you. Jessica, same question. In the year before the move, what turned your attention to the area?
Sure. So in the year before my move, I was working in West Des Moines, and my husband was working in Muscatine. He's been with H&I for about 10 years and has worked remotely for about 5 years before we moved here. And our daughter was born in 2015, and he was spending 2-3 days a week in Muscatine, and we kind of took a look back and said, where are we going to be able to spend the most time as a family? My job is actually pretty conducive to remote working, which has been really great since March, especially. But it's a little bit easier for me to work remotely. So we just kind of wanted to live where, as a family unit, we were going to be able to spend the most time together.
Super, thank you. Jennifer, same question to you. In the year before the move, what turned your attention to this area?
In the year before I moved here, it wasn't even in my intention. My intention to move to the Midwest. I had never been to the Midwest before. But my fiance and I, we were going to college at the same university. And so we were talking about what we should do after graduation. And to us, our 3 options were move closer to my parents. They live just south of Seattle, Washington, or stay in our college town, or come out to Muscatine or surrounding because he has family here. And he hadn't seen his family in a while. I had never been to this section of the US before. So I was like, sure, sign me up. And so we moved out here in July of 2018. And I think it was a really good choice for us. In Washington too, like the cost of living was so drastically different than what it is here. And just like the country in general is just different over here. So it was like something new for me. But we basically considered like, where should we be? Like, whose family should we be close to? And this one was just like the best case scenario that worked out. So we decided to move, and I had never been to Muscatine before I got here, but I liked it and it was a good move.
Great. I'm just going to follow up with the next question to the full panel, but Jennifer, with you, describe your first year and kind of settling in. How did you become familiar with the community?
Sure. So my first year in settling in, my fiance does have family here. So when we moved here, I was able to like meet more of his family that I hadn't met before, and like meet some people that they knew. So I wasn't like just by myself. I had people to meet through his family. And then I started my job search here and got hired by MCSA. So my like social life and my adjustment really took off after I got hired, because I was able to make more connections on my own and meet people that I wouldn't have otherwise met. So I would say like after moving and getting adjusted to the new city in general, and then adjusting to my new job, that made it easier for me to start to like feel more of a part of the community, and like make my own friendships and that kind of thing. So at the beginning, I was just a little nervous, but after I was able to like find people who had hobbies similar to me, and like meet more of my coworkers and learn more about them, it made it easier to adjust in.
Super. Thank you, Jennifer. Jessica, same question to you, and describe your first year and kind of settling in.
Yeah, so I mean, somewhat similar. We don't have family here, but we were very fortunate that my husband had been with H&I for a while, so he had already had the time to build some, good relationships with coworkers who definitely welcomed us and were kind of that support system. When you need to call the plumber at 2 a.m. and whatnot, folks. So that's been really great, or was really great, especially that first year. Our neighborhood is really fantastic. We, we're really kind of fortunate that we just landed in the middle of some great people, and they helped us definitely settle in that first year, similarly aged kids, being welcoming, all that good stuff. And then I would say we tried, the other big thing that kind of got us active was, looking for activities with our daughter, swim classes at the Y and whatnot that got us out of the house.
Super. Thank you. Lupita, same question. In the first year, how did it go the first year?
help out as much as I could. But it was also getting used to this new job. My work had been always in the court or always with the sheriff or running alongside of a patient with a gurney, and everything was medical and legal. And then I came back to school. So I had worked as an education coordinator in St. Cloud, Minnesota, prior to moving here. And it was just a shift. It was already happening in Minnesota, but moving here, this was no longer interpreting. So it really was a different career choice, and having to slowly let go of my world of language and working linguistically. And I really couldn't quite let go of it. And also the housing piece, as I was, I really had a hard time trying to find a decent price for housing. And it's, people kind of associate housing here in Muscatine with, for families, but then they forget those of us that are single. And it was awful. It was where people would tell me, well, we have a place. And I was just kind of dumbfounded with some of the awfulness of the things that I was being offered. We don't normally rent out a garage, but we'll rent it out to you, but it's falling apart. I was just, I was like, are you serious? It just seemed so offensive. I kept on hitting the point where I thought, dear God, how am I going to make it here? I need to stay here. And I was at the point where I would work at McDonald's just to make sure that I could be with my parents. And I really had a hard time, had it not been with the supervisors that I had that were so supportive with West Liberty School District, Iowa State University, and the principal that I had, who was who's now retired, Jim Hamilton. I had to have those, I call them the secret cheerleaders that really were so supportive in that first year, because my boss, Krista Regenator, she had told me, just one word after another, and it was very encouraging. But it was a very hard first year, and here I am. I never thought that I'd be here this long, but I'm glad. You never know. How's it? Someone told me, bloom where you are planted. So.
Thank you. Tiffany, same question. Describe your first year and kind of settling in. How did you become familiar with the community?
Sure. So obviously COVID had played a lot into myself and my daughters being able to meet people outside of my friendships that I have here at work. So my daughters were involved in showing livestock this summer, and that definitely, that community was very welcoming to us. I think they wanted to learn about what we do showing livestock on the East Coast and how different it is to out here. So that group of people was very welcoming. I also picked up a part-time job at a local restaurant. I wait tables on Friday nights and Saturday days. So that opens me up to meeting some new people here. And then within those connections, I've been able to meet people, when my AC unit stopped working, who do I call? And in my refrigerator had a situation. And all those people that I have met have been very welcoming to me and my daughters and how they can help us. And they're like, call us anytime you need anything. So that's been very positive. I think some of my ups and downs of being here just have to do with my family dynamics. Being a single mom to a 20-year-old and a 17-year-old, and having a husband back on the East Coast who's still living a chapter behind us. There's times that it's like we're moving on and we've left him behind. So those are more of our ups and downs. And I think once we're a family here, it'll be a little easier. It is harder for my daughter that's going to be 21 in February to meet people. But some of that is her personality. She's not one to get out and go, but she did find a nice full-time job at a vet clinic here, and she's meeting younger people her age and just, encouraging my kids to get outside of their comfort zones to meet people. I would say probably a challenge being a mom is I never realized moving a teenage daughter would be so difficult. You know, I think if I knew that a year ago, I don't know if we would have moved here. I had no idea the challenges of moving to a small high school. My daughter Victoria came from a class of 450. She's in a class of like 70 now. Now she doesn't participate in sports or any type of club, so that's a downfall for her not being able to, you know, really meet kids outside the classroom. But when you go into a school with kids that have known each other since kindergarten, they're not as welcoming to somebody new into their little cliques. Where I think if she was to have gone to school here in Muscatine, it would have been similar to the size of the high school she went to. It might have been a little easier for her, even though you don't think a larger high school would have been the best way to go.
No, this is profound. I think we don't talk about this enough. Even in the research we do at the University of Minnesota, nationwide with newcomers, it's around what's your experience. And I think there is that underground experience of what kind of experience do the kids have in that transition? But also what kind of experience do your trailing spouses have, or one is a trailed spouse still trailing, right? Now, how do we ensure that everybody is kind of on the same page? I think I'm going to add this kind of research around the kids a little bit more. I've been hearing it more about the kids' struggle in towns, like even without pandemic life, right? So I kind of want to follow up on that with Tiffany, with you. You know, what would you say to folks just arriving into the community today? If you met a newcomer and they're like, "What should I do?" How would you answer that?
I guess I would say get out and meet people. That's what you got to do. You got to put yourself outside of your comfort zone. You know, I thank goodness for my little part-time gig that I have at the restaurant on the weekends, because I've met some really great people there, you know, that are certainly like, call me in the middle of the night if you need anything. And, you know, they're very welcoming there. And, you know, sometimes they're like, I'm going to buy you dinner tonight. And they always ask, how's your husband doing? And just those little things that make them realize that they care, that I'm not out in a cornfield in the middle of Iowa, me and my daughters.
That's great. Lupita, same question. What would you say to people just moving into town?
Oh. I think that I would tell them to go over to check if they're needing, you know, I guess I would kind of feel it out as to what is their love, their passions, you know, because every family that I have had to already tell them when they move over and they're looking for assistance, you know, where the sales are at, or where good things are at in their areas of what they like. For example, I've come across new friends because of the African community, and they are looking specifically for certain types of greens. And so you can't find them at some of the local stores, but some of the smaller stores, they end up telling me where I can be able to find them. And as a musician, I'm looking for other musicians. And so we know how to be able to connect. And so it's, I guess, one of my first questions is, what do you play? Or do you write? Or, you know, but I guess it's my artistic piece of who I am. And in moving here, that's one of those neat things that I've been able to kind of relax and slow down, you know, and just enjoy the view. I mean, I never thought that my commute would be cows on one side and horses on the other. And my mother, we were driving, and she asked me, you drive all this way to work? And I said, yeah, Mom, it's different. I mean, I even have a favorite butcher. And and so it's you, and she just looked at me as if though I was odd, but it was, you know, I'm the Mexican that likes venison and bratwurst and sauerkraut, and it still freaks people out with the yeah, you betcha. And my world is German, and it's Swedish and Norwegian, and I miss that. So you know, I would tell people, be welcoming to the different cultures, because every place has their own culture, and examine, you know, if there's those activities that they used to have this back when I was a kid. They had the Great River Days, I was so disappointed to see that was an activity that was gone now. Go to those events. They have now certain activities that are, you bring your lawn chair and you sit and you listen to music. Those are the things that I grew up with, where my dad would take us to Davenport and we listened to Bix Beiderbecke on the jazz festival days. And we were like the only Latino family with a watermelon and tacos in aluminum foil. My dad did it on purpose to make us experience different languages, different music, different experiences. I mean, my memories are bluegrass days and going to musician unions, festivals and country music, and sitting on hay bales and poofy ladies with the Foursquare dances, blue hair, and great memories. This is my memories of what it was Muscatine childhood, and it is fun. So I would say to a newcomer, examine what there is, because Muscatine is so much more diverse, and even now it is far more diverse than it was when I was a kid here. So.
Super, thank you. Thank you. Jessica, same question. What advice would you have for some newcomers?
I would say everybody here is friendly, but that it's on you to meet people and to build relationships and to kind of get yourself settled in, as far as, being, taking that step and, just building relationships, whether it's with, neighbors or coworkers, and finding out what is available. I think lots of things here are word of mouth. It's not easy necessarily in Muscatine to get on Google and find out what's here. And so if you have a passion or something that you're interested in, you need to take the initiative probably to talk to people and to figure out who the folks are that might be able to push you in a certain direction so that you can figure out where you want to go and what you want to do and where the people with similar interests to you are. But that, once you do that, everyone here is friendly. It does fit that small town stereotype, but that you're going to have to take a lot of initiative to get there.
Great, thank you. Jennifer, same question to you. You run into a newcomer, what advice do you have for them?
I agree with what the other panelists have said, and I would also say if you had a hobby, in the current place that you lived at, try to find a similar option here. Like when I lived in Washington State, we spent a lot of time outside and went hiking and things like that. So then when I moved here, I tried to look into, there's like a path along the river and some parks and stuff that you can go spend some time outdoors. So just try to replicate your hobbies from before. You might find people that are similar minded to you and enjoy the same things that you do. I would also say don't be afraid or ashamed to say that you're not from here. There's been I can think of a couple instances where I was in a meeting and someone said, "Oh, are you from Muscatine?" And I said, "No, I'm not." And I was going to say, "But I like it here," or "But I had more to say." And they said, "Oh, okay." And they asked the person next to me, "Are you from Muscatine?" And they were like, "Yes." And then they sparked off this conversation about the middle school they went to, and I think I know your dad, and have you ever been to this place? And sometimes it feels weird to say, "No, I'm not from here." And someone says, "Oh, okay." And then they're not as interested anymore. Because I have good things to share too, So I think if you're new here, you shouldn't be nervous to say that you're new here. I think it can lead into new conversations, and it can be a good lead way into establishing a new connection with somebody.
That's great. Fascinating, you guys. So I think I've got one more, maybe two more questions here. So again, if you've got questions that you've got, you want to just throw them in chat. We'll get to them very quickly here. So I'll just go right back to you, Jennifer, on the way back through the panel. What would you say to the current class of high school kids? If you were to stand up on the stage in front of them and talk about your community, what would you say to them?
To the high school students, I would say it's beneficial to get out. If this is your hometown and you've spent 18 years of your life here, I think it's beneficial to get out and see the world. Or, on the other hand, don't be ashamed if you don't move away. I think make that choice for yourself. If you want to go out there and see what's out there, I moved and I met a ton of people I never would have met before, and I was exposed to different, ways of life and ways of thinking that I probably wouldn't have found on my own where I was before. So it can be healthy for you. And then on the other hand, if you know that that's not for you and you want to stay here, like also don't be ashamed to stay in your hometown. I think sometimes people, it's either like, yeah, I love my hometown, I'm staying here, like I went to school here and I want to stay here forever. Sometimes I think kids are afraid to say that they want to stay there based on like the social expectation that you need to move away and go to college and move away somewhere else. So like, just don't be afraid to like make whatever choice fits for you.
That's great. I appreciate that. Because, I talk about migration, people moving all the time, but some people don't. And they are a whole part of this picture too. So thank you. Jessica, same question to you. What would you be saying to your high school students?
I mean, first of all, here at Muscatine High School, I would probably be telling them to appreciate the education that they just had, because the one biggest great thing about Muscatine, I keep thinking, is how much they care about the schools and how much gets put back into the schools. But then I would tell them also, very similar to the last thing I said, learn how to put yourself out there and how to build relationships, because, I think that's easier to do, when you're a kid, and it gets a whole lot harder as you're an adult. So if you don't fall out of that practice, I think you're going to be a much happier adult, when you hit your 30s and you do go somewhere else, when you have your kids or not. If you don't have your kids, you probably will move. And it's not easy being an adult and making friends. So learn how to do that now and don't fall out of that practice.
Awesome. Love it. Lupita, same question. You're in front of your kids. What do you tell them?
I think my personal experience was something where I didn't look back, and it was something that I don't regret. It made me have to explore what there were in different countries. So move forward and explore as much as you can, the earlier that you can. And who knows, maybe God will laugh and make you have to come back 30 years later. Because I remember the day I graduated from Muscatine High School, and I was like, yep, I already had a scholarship in hand. I was ready to move, and my plans were set. Like within, I would say it was just stunning how my steps were already set before me. And I would say to anybody, there's no regrets in being able to examine what there is beyond Muscatine, but don't burn your bridges. You just might need to be back home. And the people that loved you are still going to love you when you come back.
Super, thank you. Tiffany, same question. You're in front of the high school kids. What are you going to say to them?
Well, I think the other panelists had some really great ideas. I think what I would add to that is don't worry about your fellow classmates judging you, whether you left for a little while, you left for a long time. And I think that's kind of my thought here is my family's getting to explore Iowa. If we end up back on the East Coast, whether it's in 5 years or 20 years, we got to experience something we would have never experienced before. So don't worry about what other people are going to think or judge you for the decisions that you made that you thought were right for yourself and your family at that time.
Super. I've got just one last question here. Real briefly, everybody. At what point did you think, I'm part of the community now? Was there a point, or maybe not? Or Tiffany, you want to go first here?
Sure. So yeah, there's definitely days that I don't think I'm part of the community yet. I think my daughter did very well showing lambs this year at the county fair, and she got chosen as reserve champion and got to go on to the Southeast Iowa Showdown where she was reserve champion U. And a couple people on the bleachers that were sitting with myself and my mom that day turned around and said, "Welcome to Iowa." So I guess that's a little bit of competitiveness in our family, is we proved that we could be here and we could compete. But I think there's sometimes that I don't know that I'll ever be a true Iowan. If somebody's just saying, "What are you doing?" I'm like, I refer to New Hampshire as my home, and that's probably how we'll always be. And, it's very interesting. The community says to me, "Oh, well, where do you live?" And when I tell them, they say, "Oh, you live in so-and-so's house." So I don't know if it'll ever be the Briggs house on 170th, but we'll see. But I do want to thank you for having me on your panel, and hopefully some of my experiences will help somebody in the future.
Thank you. Really great. Thank you. Lupita, same question. Did you ever feel like you had to call this home again, or like you had to reestablish yourself to be a part of the community again? Or
There were three things that had happened. The first was I had to change my Minnesota driver's license and give it to the person at the DMV. And it was painful to let go of it and give it to her. That was the first. The second was that just happened recently, where it happened, I'd say last month. I had to close my Supreme Court Minnesota interpreter roster listing. And so they asked me, so what is your phone number so that we can continue? And that's like, you know, when the sheriffs, it's 4 o'clock in the morning, someone had an accident and they needed a legal interpreter. And so I'd be like, yes, court interpreter. And then I would specify my roster number, and all of that was gone. She just kind of stayed quiet, and she goes and she says, is there something wrong? And I said, I'm sorry, ma'am, but the number that you're giving me is no longer active. And I think I'm needing to say that I have to stay in Iowa. And she said, if you decide to come back, you've already, you know, we have your file, not a problem. But it was almost like painful to have to just say, I'm here, you know, this is where I'm at. And the last one was honestly about 2 weeks ago. My best friend said, you're from Iowa, give it up, let go of St. Cloud. I was like, oh, yeah, I guess. And so I can't get quite used to the warm winters, but today it's 70 degrees. Are you kidding me? You know, I'm used to like 4 below zero. It's November. It's not usually 4. Maybe it's about 20 degrees, and it feels good to be without a sweater. You just like t-shirts and shorts weather. I'm from Iowa. I'm the secret Minnesotan, but I'm from Iowa. So.
I live in St. Cloud, Lupita, so just so you know,
Oh,
it's 65
you know.
degrees here today too. So anyway, thank you. Jessica, the same question. At what point did you think I'm part of the community now?
Yeah, so mine was actually pretty recently. I'm involved with the Community Foundation on the board, and this past spring with the COVID situation, I was asked to be on the Community Continuity Granting Committee, which was a fund where we granted out funds for needed response to COVID. And I felt as part of that committee, I really got a good handle on what was going on in the community and felt very up to date on what was going on in the community. And I feel like prior to that, maybe I wasn't that informed, and that it's not that easy actually to be informed about the community all the time. And that was really kind of the moment for me.
Super, thank you. Jennifer, same question.
At the beginning when I moved here, I didn't know that many people, so I kind of enjoyed the sense of like anonymity that I had. Like I could go somewhere and I probably wouldn't run into someone that I knew. And like as an introvert at the beginning in my transition, I kind of liked that. But then as like time went on and I started to make more connections, then when I would like go to the store or go out and do something and I would see people that I knew, I would get more excited. Like, oh, there's that person I recognize. I'm gonna go say hi, that sort of thing. So like as I started to like be more excited to see people that I knew, I started to like feel like more of a member of the community. And then we recently bought a house, and our realtor was like, this is it now. Like you are probably never leaving. And we're like, well, I don't know about never, but she was like, once you're in, like you're in. So like I started, like now I live in a neighborhood, and like I lived downtown before. So I guess just like adjusting to my community and like having more connections, I feel more of a part now.
Super, thank you. Really, everybody, thank you for your time on the panel. Just your open voices, your caring, your concern, your love for the community that you've got. You can hear it in your voice. I just appreciate the openness and honesty you provided with everybody here today. I know I, for one, if not everybody here, just thanks you for your time here today. So I think I don't know. So I haven't been monitoring chat as well. Charlotte, maybe you have any other questions?
We do. I have a couple questions. One of them says, has anyone employed or looked into recruiting cultural ambassadors for our migrant or refugee community?
I had tried to write it, but I had said that there isn't a cultural ambassador committee, but it would be helpful for our community to be able to have that. It is needed, but people seem to find each other and find the advocates that support and help a family or a single person feel welcome. Currently, I'd say in Muscatine, usually I've been able to see it within the African community and the Latino community. And it is something where I'd say in the minority population, we're able to find each other and we know where the safe spaces are. And when I say safe, there are some places where you wouldn't say that someone has had a bad experience. And so they'll say, hey, be careful. That situation is not a safe situation. It's not a safe place. Or they made me feel very uncomfortable, or, and so people will voice if Muscatine is a safe place, because it has its two pieces where you have that feeling of being felt that you are welcome, but you also have that piece where something has happened so poorly and that looks, it shows a poor reflection of who we are as a community. And so I have found more than once where I've had to say, no, if it was so bad, I wouldn't be here. And so I've had to address that there is that need. But if you have something where, there are job opportunities, back home, we had what were called cultural navigators, and they were in, and they're still currently in the St. Cloud School District, as far as I know, back in Minnesota. But here, what I do is a community liaison. But what you need is, I work at the level of students and parents. But there needs to be something I would propose. If you ever had that grant opportunity, it would be for a welcoming committee, where, and I'm just saying from the experience that I've seen when I first moved to my hometown back in Minnesota, there was a welcoming committee, and I was so freaked out by it because I wasn't used to somebody calling me up and saying, hey, we've got coupons. I'm like, coupons? I am like the coupon queen of the Latino version. I will go to every single place on purpose to go check it out. I mean, I was looking at everything from the St. Cloud State University to the bakery to every single place that there was. I took advantage of that. So it isn't necessarily that you need to have a committee specifically just for one population. I would say there's so many businesses that exist that have such positive and creative ways of showing that Muscatine is a good place. Propose it, because we don't know it. And we don't know what there is here unless you bring it to our attention. I'm saying it as someone who grew up here and moved away. A lot of the places that I knew don't even exist. I came back to my home theater being torn down to the ground. The Latino community, a lot of the buildings, they're parking lots. My childhood Catholic church, St. Mary's, it's gone. So, and that's where the Latino community would come to. I have memories of where we had the parade, and it was something for September the 16th. And it wasn't that there were activities that happened. So I would say you have an opportunity here in Muscatine to bring those cultural opportunities of who we are. If there's a German festival, put it in there. If there's something that, you have your Muscatine magazine, put it in there, because we don't know. And I love all those kinds of things, but that's my background. So I hope that helps a little bit. And if you want to do a cultural navigator piece, throw it in, because I would love to sign up for anything to help you with it. So.
Thank you. We had some comments that went along with Lupita's comments. They indicated Louisa County is working on that, and Mallory Smith, who's participating today, has information along those lines. We have a local newcomers club that provides some information, and then Ottumwa, Iowa has a robust welcome and connect program, and they encourage you to take a look at that. It's run actually by a former Muscatine resident, they indicate. So do you have time for one more question, Ben? One more question. If you could have designed it, how would you have liked to have been connected or welcomed that you weren't?
So Jennifer?
If I could have designed it, I think I met a lot of people who weren't in my age group when I came. And so if I could have designed it any sort of way, I would have wished to have like more people around my age group to welcome me in. Not that I didn't enjoy people that were older than me, but it was harder for me to connect with them. I mean, it's like self-explanatory, I guess. We just have a lot of different things in common. Or like we don't have as many things in common. So I guess I would have just liked a more diverse audience, I guess, to welcome me in.
We'll actually be talking about that next in 2 weeks, about how you market to different age groups. Jessica, same question.
I think Jenny just answered it very well. I think, yeah, it's harder to meet folks maybe in our age group a little bit. I think also, and I'd mentioned this before, I think everything here is word of mouth. And it was awesome because my husband had, you know, a group that we could go to. But I mean, I don't necessarily have that group. And so for me, wishing I could find more things, you know, whether it's related to childcare or just clubs or this or that on the internet, you have to search really hard. And I wish there was a resource where it was so much easier just to go to one place and find out what Muscatine has to offer.
Right. Lupita, same question.
I was dealing with some of the technical difficulties. Could you repeat the question? I'm sorry. I had some things happening and they were asking.
If you could have designed it, how would you have liked to have been welcomed or connected that you weren't?
I wish I would have been able to find help right off the bat with housing. I wish I would have been able to honestly even find or find a property prior to moving here. I wish that there were, it sounds really dumb, but lights. There were so many places here in Muscatine where it surprised me that there was the Musco, I think it's called Musco, but there's like this top of the line lighting company here, but so many places didn't have a lot of lights. And it sounds really poor, but it was just, I wish that as much as people would say to me, you know, that yeah, things were going to work out, it just wasn't that easy. I would say that even though those rough moments happened, I was able to find those opportunities to make new friends, and the African community really embraced me. And had I not had some of those difficulties, I would not have come across, you know, working with the students that I've had with music and working with, you know, so maybe, you know, maybe because of those hardships, I was able to come across, you know, precisely the people that were going through also the same types of difficulties and looking for housing, looking for what there was of transportation. You know, someone had said, you know, that they were able to find something for helping to, I can't remember who had mentioned it, but they needed something, you know, for example, I needed to get a refrigerator, but to be able to move things. And when you're by yourself, you know, you can't always go to your family because your family is elderly and you don't know anybody. And the people that you do know, that's everybody's, you know, it's just a different world. You know, moving here and you're single. And so many of the things that were here, they're meant like for families, but for single people, it's just hard. So yeah, I wish that there was more of, you know, I would say I would have some of the most hard conversations because people would assume that either I didn't speak English or that I didn't read English or that it was just hard. Some of the ignorance. And so I would say that there's so many good things of Muscatine, but there's still some things that are not kind. And so I would wish that it was different. And I'm not one to step away from a challenge, and And so you still see me here, and I still encourage other people to stay here, because we are the difference that we wish to be, is by being present, by not running away from the challenge. And so when I think, like, even doing this, I'm a very private person, so this isn't easy, but I'm here.
We appreciate it. Thank you. Tiffany, last comment of the day.
Sure. I guess I feel that, I felt like I needed to be independent when I first came here. I felt like this is a decision myself and my husband and our daughters made, and I shouldn't be having to rely on other people to get through my situation. So I guess I was able to handle some of this because I'm stubborn, and I was like, well, this is what we chose. This is how we have to handle this. I think if I looked kind of at the school situation, I think I wish the school had handled some things different. This is kind of just a scenario, just for people to see a little bit where my daughter was coming from at certain times. She came in January, so there were no more student parking. So they said, well, just go over and park over in the teacher parking. Well, you think like that's not a big deal. And then we sat back and thought about that. Here's a 16-year-old girl that doesn't want to be singled out, and she has to walk into school different than everybody else. And the school at the time was like, oh, it's no big deal. You can park over there. And, her dad and I kind of felt the same way. Like, well, that's no big deal. You can park over there and walk into school. Well, when you're a 16-year-old girl and you're walking across a completely different parking lot, that is a huge big deal when you don't like attention drawn to yourself. So, I guess I just really kind of felt like I needed to handle our situation on my own because that's what we chose to do. So hopefully that helps everybody out.
This is great. Thank you. Really, thanks to the four panelists here, Jennifer, Jessica, Lupita, and Tiffany. Thank you for opening yourselves up. Thank you to everyone for your time here today. I think we're going to turn this back to Charlotte at this point.
Yeah, Ben, we certainly want to thank you for opening our perspective to the narrative within our community, and especially on how we take a look and wrap our arms around our strengths. Again, I want to thank Jody for participation, and obviously Jessica, Tiffany, Jenny, and Lupita. We had amazing comments about their insights they provided to us today and how they opened their hearts and gave us their time. And we thank them for joining our community, but we especially thank them for sharing their stories with us. I want to recognize Kathy Vance, Natalie Jones, Kim Warren, Vivian Jardim, Naomi DeWinter, and Jeremy Pickard, who've been working behind the scenes today. I want to thank our board leadership at the Community Foundation of Greater Muscatine and the Community Foundation of Louisa County that had the insight to bring Ben to the community and start these conversations. And I especially want to thank Ben, for your time today. We've got 2 more sessions coming up, and I think they're going to be just as eye-opening. Resident recruitment will be 2 weeks from now on November 20th from 11 to 1, and we all play a part. And I think we're starting to see that from today's conversation. And then moving in, moving out, moving over, and Ben's going to talk about workforce housing and workforce housing available and how we can be more strategic around that. I would encourage you for the session on the 20th to have, it's going to be a little bit more interactive. So if you can access on something outside your phone, maybe a tablet or computer, I think it'll even make it more beneficial for you. Please, from an information perspective, we want to let you know that we'll be getting out an email on Tuesday that's going to have information on the next 2 sessions. It's going to have the PDF that Ben provided today, so you'll have the slides within that PDF, and we'll have a link for the recording for anybody that wants to take a look at that. In the meantime, if you get a chance, please reach out to a newcomer and ask them to share their story, and then please listen and help them connect and find ways to connect, and also share your pride and your love of our community, because it's an amazing place to live. With that, I thank all of you for your time, for participating today. We're grateful for the part you play in making Muscatine and Louisa counties the place that we can all call home and fill that with so much pride. We see you in 2 weeks. Hopefully, Ben, you'll be back with us, right? 2 weeks. So I hope that you enjoy this beautiful day. Thank you so much for everyone's participation.